thank you so much for all of you to take part on this particular debate that I have to be honest is very close to heart to me because it involves two topics that are fascinating. Even we had a recent discussion in the Brazilian Senate in April, the Legislatures of the Americas conference, which we had a fascinating discussion about the nature of legislative drafting, whether if it was a science or if it was an art, as a previous discussion between Wade Ballou from the US Congress and Fotis Vitsidis from the Hellenic Parliament. And also in artificial intelligence that it's a necessity to discuss today, either in parliaments or in other areas of our societies. So allow me to bring my first question to you, João. In parliaments, AI holds substantial potential to augment the processes of drafting, analyzing and amending legislation, which often involve dealing with considerable amounts of multifaceted legal text and data. Could you illuminate how specific AI applications could be harnessed to address prevalent challenges in legislative drafting within parliaments, such as improving the management of legislative amendments, ensuring the consistency in language and terms across multiple legislative documents, or facilitating efficient legal text analysis? João, please feel free to share your thoughts with us in 4 minutes, please.
Os textos são a essência do trabalho de uma casa legislativa. É a matéria-prima e também o produto. Os grandes modelos de linguagem, como o GPT, são versáteis na geração e na transformação dos textos, o que traz oportunidades para o processo legislativo. No entanto, é importante ressaltar que o GPT não é a solução para todos os problemas. Ele é excelente para certas tarefas, onde alcança resultados inimagináveis até pouco tempo atrás. Contudo, para outras tarefas, métodos tradicionais de processamento simbólico ainda se mostram mais eficazes. A legística, ciência voltada ao aprimoramento das técnicas de elaboração das leis, se divide em duas áreas principais, a legística formal e a legística material. A legística formal trata da forma e da estrutura da lei. Já a material foca no conteúdo substancial da lei e considera não apenas a etapa da elaboração, como também a avaliação após a transformação do projeto de lei em lei. Eu venho testando o ChatGPT em aplicações tanto na legística formal quanto na legística material, por meio de um protótipo adaptado à nossa tradição legislativa e jurídica, que é parte do Civil Law. Planejamos, no futuro, integrar essas funcionalidades ao nosso editor de autoria de documentos legislativos, LexEdit. Por enquanto, isso só está como protótipo. No âmbito da legística formal, os experimentos indicam que o ChatGPT é eficaz em várias atividades. Por exemplo, a ferramenta pode analisar a clareza, a precisão e a ordem lógica do texto, segundo as regras estabelecidas na nossa Lei Complementar 95 de 98, que é a Lei da Técnica Legislativa. Em diversos testes, o ChatGPT sugeriu, entre outras coisas, a inclusão de termos para tornar o texto mais preciso, a substituição de palavras para tornar a terminologia mais consistente e o reposicionamento ou divisão de dispositivos para melhorar a ordem lógica. No entanto, quando se trata de aspectos estruturais, o desempenho do ChatGPT ainda é limitado. Até o momento, o parser de processamento simbólico tradicional, desenvolvido internamente na nossa equipe, é mais acurado e eficaz do que tentar fazer com o ChatGPT. Quanto à legística material, embora tenhamos realizado poucos testes, já se percebe um potencial significativo. Ao contrário das ferramentas tradicionais de processamento simbólico, que lidam mais com a sintaxe, o GPT é capaz de compreender o conteúdo semântico das normas. Em um teste, por exemplo, solicitamos que a ferramenta sugerisse melhorias para uma norma jurídica do Tribunal Superior Eleitoral sobre fake news. A ferramenta sugeriu, por exemplo, a inclusão de medidas educativas e uma definição para o termo desinformação. Por fim, os criadores do ChatGPT, de forma diferente de outros inventores, não previram todos os casos de uso. Habilidades emergentes estão sendo descobertas. O domínio legislativo oferece um campo vasto para a aplicação dessa tecnologia. Obrigado.
Thank you so much, João, for your considerations about this topic. Matthew, would you like to share your thoughts also in 4 minutes?
Yes, thank you. I think from our perspective, we've tried some experiments with ChatGPT and Bing Chat so far. It seems to us that generative AI is good at making things up. That's a strong point and a weak point. So it seems to us that it's not reliable for you don't want to ask it what is the legal answer to this, but drafting is making things up. Drafting is creating new law where there isn't some law. So in that sense, there is a sort of alignment there. We did try asking ChatGPT to write an Act of Parliament, and there were interesting results. It wasn't very good neither in the logic nor in the way it worded it. But what was good is that it thought of things that we hadn't asked it for. Now, usually things we haven't asked for is a problem, but sometimes things we haven't asked for is because we forgot to ask for them. So it could be a reminder. What really worries us, I think, is that if people start using it to do first drafts, that will push drafters down a particular route, and that even if we as drafters don't do that, the policy officials giving us the instructions saying they want a law about such and such, they are going to be hugely tempted to go to ChatGPT and say, write me a law about such and such. So they then compare it with what we produced. That in itself isn't necessarily a problem unless it pulls them into thinking about the wrong things, diverts them from what they would have been thinking about otherwise, and particularly if it means that they give us the ChatGPT draft and say, oh, just polish this up for us, will you? Because we can't work on their drafts. We need to know what effects they want to achieve. We have thought about using AI for searching the statute book when you need to know what kinds of other provisions on these lines have been made where, and the fact of anybody's statute book is that it's been made over 100 years or more than 100 years. So there's a lot of different styles, a lot of different ways of putting things, which do make it difficult to use a traditional word search. But we would see it as a question of combining a traditional word search and an AI search, if you like. The two together we would see as producing some kind of result, rather than ever, at the moment, ever feeling we could rely on something that we got out of a generative AI. So that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your patience. Joe, would you like to share your thoughts on this matter as well?
Yeah. So similarly, ChatGPT seems like it will be a great tool for certain things that could be done now. I mean, I wouldn't, similar to what Matthew was saying, I wouldn't want to see a draft given over or used with certain software that was completely handled in ChatGPT, because it's not going to make sense and might increase the process. But similar to the search, I think one of the potential for ChatGPT currently as it exists is as a summarization engine for parts of legislation so that we can create easily readable, plain language examples of parts of drafts or bills or court interpretations or the like, so that a drafter could reference these quickly and see, kind of like a search, going into the document, then seeing the exact language, but not necessarily even needing to go into the document. Like, okay, this is what I wanted to talk about. These drafts cover, or these bills cover it. So I need to address that in my draft, at least at a start, so that I can get started and build a corpus of relevant material in a quicker fashion without having to painstakingly read through everything. Along with that, I think it would be able to potentially analyze a system that has already collected a large, either a large language model or other examples of like amendments, and then actually be used to draft amendments. So it wouldn't be all of ChatGPT by itself, but if we could take the semantic capabilities of ChatGPT as it exists now and combine it with very specific large language models, we could then actually start to draft portions of bills or amendments so that it frees up the time and efforts of drafters or other people involved with creating the legislation in ways that now they can use their creative powers or their logic powers to solve the problems and not worry about the language and getting it exactly right all the time.
Thank you so much, Joe, for your considerations. William, would you like to share your thoughts on this question as well?
Yeah, thank you, Luis. I'll be echoing some of the thoughts that were discussed by the previous panelists, but I really see AI helping kind of in two general areas. That's in generating content, as we've discussed, and then also the analysis component of existing information. So I think first and foremost, as the technology develops, it's really going to be a potential time saver. As some of the other panelists mentioned, there's also the possibility, especially in the early stages of the technology, that it may create additional work for drafters in particular, if members are bringing these drafts that are created on, specifically ChatGPT or some of those more the publicly available models. But I think it has an incredible potential for saving time. And one of those ways that was just touched on is I think it will free up legislators to maybe connect different ideas and policies that they wouldn't have considered otherwise. So even if it's not drafting bill language per se, it could be, a legislator has an idea about a particular topic. And so they ask ChatGPT or another model to, provide a response based on that. And a lot of times when you provide those prompts, ChatGPT can do a good job of connecting ideas that maybe the person wouldn't have been aware of to begin with. So I think it can connect a lot of things that are otherwise maybe less obvious. The other thing that it can do too is, ChatGPT can compare some text, especially paragraphs. But I think outside of ChatGPT, if you're looking at other models that are available, I think some open source models are starting to become more available, and other pay models, but you can actually compare documents. And so I think even if that's not necessarily used by a drafter, a member of a legislature could use that as well. And that kind of gets into the analysis component as well. I think as the tools get more sophisticated, they're going to be used for different tasks. So for example, the optical character recognition models, those are tools that could turn typed or handwritten or printed text into machine encoded text, which at that point then you could use for a broader comparison. And then and again, as the technology develops, you'll have better models for document layout analysis, which can identify individual building blocks of a document, or document parsing, which could then take information from a document, extract that key information, and then analyze that together. And same thing with information in tables. So I think as that technology advances, it's going to become more useful in a lot of ways, but then again, it will create additional challenges.
Thank you so much, William, for your considerations. Allow me to bring my second question to Matthew. As we delve deeper into the incorporation of generative AI models such as ChatGPT, as we are discussing here, into the legislative drafting process, the interplay between this technology and the prevailing standards like XML becomes critical. given that XML serves as a backbone for information structuring and exchange in the legislative context, it's essential to consider its integration with AI models. So my question is, could you elucidate the potential implications for aligning these two dimensions? The first one, AI's text generation capabilities and structure, and they structure interoperable format of XML. And my second question is, how might this alignment address challenges such as the comprehension of legal syntax, semantics, and the management of potential AI biases, and ensuring the robustness of the legislative text? Matthew, would you like to?
Thank you. These are the questions that we find most interesting. We don't use XML at the moment. We are looking to move to XML. We use Word with a great deal of data added and a great deal of structure embedded in it. But we do see this idea of joining modern AI with traditional structured data and XML as being the way forward, particularly this idea of legal syntax and semantics. So our project is looking at having the drafters mark up the basic logical structure of the drafts that we're writing as we go along. The most obvious way to be able to do that is by tagging in XML. And the point of being able to do it is to be able to have a reasoner, a program that can actually follow the if-then logic of the legislation through whatever twists and turns we've been forced to build into it. So we often end up drafting exceptions to exceptions to exceptions. We don't do that just because we're horrible people. We do it because we're asked to do it, because life is complicated, and regulating human life is a complicated business, and you do need to provide for exceptions, and often for exceptions to exceptions. So we are particularly interested in that ability to follow through. What are the right questions that a human needs to be answering in order to be able to understand how this piece of draft legislation applies to their situation or their constituents if they're a member of a parliament. And we see AI as helping. We would hope in the end to be able to have drafting tools that are beyond what we've got at the moment, that use some AI to anticipate what you might want to do next, but also that cater for the things that you are going to do in legislation. You're going to impose obligations, impose prohibitions, give powers, make definitions. Those are the fundamental things that we do, and we do them in a fairly straightforward way in Commonwealth legislative drafting. So we'd like to see tools that are built on the drafter being able to do that in the same way as programmers have integrated development environments. Programmers are used to being able to see what they're doing and how it's structured. We ought to be able to see what we're doing and how it's structured, which doesn't necessarily mean that we're wording it differently, but we have understood the logic behind the wording that we're using in our natural language, and the computer's understood it too, and is able to let us know when there's a problem, and is able to make sure that we can check that the results are what everyone else is expecting. So I do think that is the most interesting possibility for AI here.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your considerations. João, do you have any thoughts about this?
Sim. Diferente do Matthew, nós utilizamos XML há mais de 20 anos aqui no Senado. E essa questão é muito boa, pois oferece uma oportunidade para eu explicar de forma breve o papel do XML na gestão de projetos de leis e das normas jurídicas no tempo. Trata-se de um detalhe que só vim perceber após vários anos trabalhando com XML, e por isso merece ser compartilhado aqui. O XML é muito eficiente para estruturar e identificar segmentos distintos do texto legislativo. No entanto, quando falamos sobre a gestão do texto do projeto de lei durante o processo legislativo, ou sobre a gestão temporal da norma jurídica, não realizamos essa tarefa diretamente no XML, mas sim em um banco de dados relacional. As informações estruturadas no XML são importadas para o banco de dados e utilizamos um sistema de informação para enriquecer esses dados com metadados. Temos também um procedimento que exporta os dados enriquecidos do banco de dados para o formato XML. Portanto, o XML é ótimo para importar automaticamente e exportar conteúdo para outras aplicações. Mas, para a gestão do texto ao longo do tempo, realizamos essa tarefa com apoio do banco de dados e de um sistema de informação. Agora, falando sobre a interação XML com a inteligência artificial. Uma limitação atual dos modelos de linguagem é a janela de contexto, que considera o somatório da quantidade de tokens do prompt de entrada com a quantidade de tokens da saída. Embora a API do GPT-4 permita uma janela de 32.000 tokens, que é adequada para análise da maioria dos projetos de lei, o custo de processamento aumenta significativamente quando comparado às janelas menores de 4.000 ou 16.000 tokens. Por ser um formato que ocupa mais espaço devido às tags autoexplicativas que delimitam o conteúdo, o XML não é o meio mais eficaz e econômico para fornecer dados estruturados ao GPT. Não é. No entanto, isso não é um problema, pois o conteúdo XML pode ser facilmente transformado para outros formatos, como JSON, como Markdown, ou até mesmo texto simples. Assim, é bastante viável e recomendável transformar o formato XML em um formato não estruturado ou semi-estruturado antes da interação com o GPT ou com a API do GPT. Era isso que eu tinha para explicar.
Thank you so much, João, for your considerations. Allow me to yield the floor to Joe. Joe, would you like to share your thoughts on this one as well?
Oh, sure. I may sound like a broken record from earlier from some of the other panelists, but and sorry, William, if I steal some of your thoughts here. But one of the things I see with XML is the analytical side of what AI can do, and it's less about generative here. And so that if you're drafting, it could potentially see what you're doing and suggest using the XML as a roadmap, what it thinks should come next. So if you're in the preamble of something and it knows what follows and it sees you're in there, it could say, well, now what you're writing, the content doesn't necessarily look like a preamble. Should this be in the body or should it be somewhere else in the document, and try and guide whoever's generating content to the right spot there. Partially because of what was just mentioned, XML is very heavy from a textual representation. All of XML is text. And so if you're looking at the body of the XML document, it's going to cause problems, both from the AI looking at it as a whole and trying to see what you're doing, as well as just being massive and causing bottlenecks or in resources or in resources either in computing or monetary or just in other processing mechanisms. And with that being said, I just, XML is very important for structuring the law. It goes hand in hand, but we do have to take that step back and see what are we doing to determine if it's a good tool for this, because in structuring the XML, like I said, it could help point where people need to go, but in generating XML, I think there are other processes that are better as well, like mapping out data either through a database or through just, I mean, the content itself. I mean, since it can understand potentially what the content means, it could give clues to where it needs to be. But beyond that, at the moment, I don't think it's necessarily right for it. In the future, if we can refine the models, I think with XML being a great roadmap, it could take something like an unstructured plain text document and map it out to where it should be in the XML, but that's in the future.
Thank you so much, Joe, for your considerations. Don't even turn off your mic because my next question is for you. Basically, while generative AI tools like GPT-4 or Google Bear, depending on the country you are, can offer broad utility, there is a distinct importance in tailored drafting systems that are specifically designed to meet the unique demands of parliamentary operations, something that Xcential is a specialist in providing to parliaments. These bespoke solutions can align closely with specific syntax, terminology, and protocols of legislative drafting, which tools such as GPT would most certainly fail, as we are discussing here. Could you elaborate on the significance and advantages of such tailored tools in the context of legislative drafting?
I could try. So the heart of the matter is what we have now in the generative systems primarily is general language usage, and this doesn't fit in with the specifics that are often necessary when we draft legislation. But that's a problem with a built-in solution. Legislative bodies have very distinct rules for drafting their legislation, and most of them have existed for a long period of time. And what this does is create a nice body of documents and information that can then be used to further refine these generalized technologies into specific technologies. So, I mean, take the US Congress, for example. There's been 100, and I think we're on the 18th session right now. And so that's a giant corpus of information that we can then take and layer on top of ChatGPT. It could be its own large language model to further enhance what's available, what the systems have to create these specialized content systems. And once we have these specialized content systems, we can then be a bit more comfortable in having it draft sections. I'm a firm believer in it can draft a early draft, and we still have to review it, refine it, make it actually usable. But we have the information to do it, and we just need the resources to be made by either government bodies or through grants or through private companies to take this information, format it in a way that can be further trained upon, and then just start drafting with it, because the technology is there to start this. We have the information. We're in a very unique meeting of those two worlds where we have all the tools we need to get going. We just need to be given permission and the resources to do it.
Thank you so much, Joe, for your considerations. João, would you like to comment on that?
Sim, eu concordo com os dois pontos principais colocados na pergunta. Primeiro, os sistemas de elaboração de leis devem ser adaptados à tradição legislativa de cada país, pois não existe uma ferramenta única que atenda às especificidades de todos os parlamentos. E o ChatGPT, ele falha ao tentar realizar o trabalho de estruturação, que os passas tradicionais fazem muito bem. Sendo assim, é necessário investir tempo e esforço na adaptação desses padrões de estruturação e de identificação dos elementos que compõem um projeto de lei ou uma lei, de acordo com a técnica legislativa utilizada em cada país. Em 2007, eu estudei com a professora Mônica Palmirani e com o professor Fábio Vitali em Bolonha, e nos anos seguintes adaptamos o formato XML do Acomatoso para a técnica legislativa do Brasil. Nos anos seguintes, adaptamos também o identificador, o RN-Lex, desenvolvido pelo Instituto de Pesquisa de Firenze, para a identificação de documentos legislativos e jurídicos no Brasil. Desenvolvemos várias ferramentas que usam essas especificações. Essa etapa de adaptação ou regionalização é bem importante, pois esse formato adaptado à tradição legislativa permite aplicar a tecnologia de forma mais acurada e precisa. Gostaria de enfatizar, contudo, que a aplicação do ChatGPT ou do GPT para outros aspectos que não sejam os sintáticos ou os estruturais pode trazer benefícios imediatos, como expliquei na questão anterior. Sugestões sobre clareza, sobre precisão, sobre ordem lógica ou ainda aspectos de logística material podem ser aplicados de forma bem-sucedida em qualquer sistema de autoria, mesmo utilizando um simples processador de texto. Temos uma grande oportunidade pela frente.
Thank you so much, João, for... Eu estou ouvindo... Sorry. Thank you so much, João, for your... I'm sorry, I was just hearing the interpretation as well. So thank you so much, João, for your considerations. Matthew, would you like to share your thoughts as well?
Yes, thank you. We do see this question of tailoring as very important. As the other speakers have said, you can't use one parliament's systems in another parliament. And it does worry us, obviously, that as with everything else in the internet is dominated by the USA, and American approaches to doing things may be spread by AI. So we would like to see these generative AI systems being fed with specific sets of texts from different jurisdictions. Having said that, I was impressed that when we first asked ChatGPT to draft, we just said an act of Parliament. It recognised that that was going to be a UK act. It could have been any other place that has a Parliament, but it didn't assume that it was a piece of American legislation, which is, to be honest, what I thought it would do. So tailoring to each jurisdiction, but also tailoring to how those jurisdictions draft. So as I said earlier, in the British Commonwealth tradition, we do have a disciplined way of drafting that is fairly close to a controlled natural language, and we could get the two things to almost meet. In our project at the moment, we're looking at the different ways in which we draft the same logical structure, but getting drafters to agree that all those ways are not only logically equivalent, but are legally equivalent, so that we can have something that's tailored to that modern Commonwealth approach of drafting. I take the point about the fact that we have huge bodies of statutes existing already. It does worry me thinking that we're going to be getting generative AI to look back across the entire statute book, because the way we wrote things 100 years ago is not the way we want to write them today. And I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your considerations. William, would you like to share your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thank you, Luís. Yeah, so I think, again, kind of echoing against some of the sentiment of the other panelists, I think there's a lot of potential, but we would need to proceed pretty carefully and ensure that any model that is tailored to a specific institution reflects the preferences of that institution. If that's style, or if that's the type of information that a new model might be generated from. So in terms of style, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that could possibly be integrated into that. So that could be certain artifacts of a particular legislative document. As we know, every single legislative institution has its own rules, its own procedures, its own style. And so even simple things like replacing, titles correctly, session-specific references for amendments, and just following legislation and the different stages of the legislative process as drafts are revised. I think there's some really simple conveniences that could be generated by a tailored specific model. So not something that necessarily saves a lot of time per bill, but if you're looking at thousands of bills, potentially in a session, they could save a lot of time overall. And then it'll make it easier to have more precise language throughout a bill, possibly. So for example, I could foresee an interface in the future where an AI may prompt certain components of the bill. So for example, the effective date based on the end of a program. So if AI model incorporated not just the past language from legislation, but also incorporated a state's statutes, then potentially an AI could follow some very complex guidelines in terms of requests. So for an effective date for a program, you could say potentially, this bill has to do with a new program that's clustered within another program, and then the effective date will be 45 days after the program's fiscal year. And so as that bill moves through the process, then that's information that could be updated or integrated into the response from the AI. I think another example is with appropriations. So if an appropriation is outlined in an initial draft of a bill, but then that appropriation changes throughout the legislative process, it's possible that an AI could differentiate that and then update that as the bill moves forward. So for example, in the US, a lot of programs specifically with human resources or human services will have requirements for matching grants between the federal government and state government. So it's possible with more complicated bills that AI would be able to, as a funding level for a bill changes, it could react and reintegrate, rebalance appropriation levels within a bill. Again, with the caveat that just because an AI model may be able to do that, it would still require a great deal of human oversight to ensure that it's done accurately.
Thank you so much, William, for your considerations. My next question is to you, actually. The application of AI models like GPT-4 and legislative drafting, while promising, inevitably comes with a set of concerns and potential pitfalls. The possibility, as we mentioned here, to generate even false legal precedent or producing legal and formatting precisions, along with the risk of a lack of contextual understanding, are key challenges. Furthermore, the handling of sensitive and classified information within the model poses a substantial concern. Could you deep dive into these issues, providing insight on how they might be addressed by legislatures and parliaments as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think this is an issue that we're really focused on at NCSL. I think it's going to be something that legislatures are going to have to start really dealing with as they adopt these technologies for whatever purpose. And you mentioned several, key issues there, and I'll talk about three. I think first and foremost is the issue of privacy. That's not necessarily just with private information, but also with legally confidential information. So this is it's something that could put states in a tenuous situation if they don't handle this properly. So in terms of the privacy issue, you do have most states have laws about that any work dealing with a draft legislation is confidential. So and any information that a person puts into any kind of third-party proprietary software could technically then become the property of that software. So for example, if a legislative staffer takes an idea from a legislator, puts that into ChatGPT before that bill's been introduced, then technically that information could be publicly available through the company, technically speaking. ChatGPT has said in the past that it's not using prompts to train its model, but that doesn't mean that other AI models wouldn't. So you could run into a situation where an individual puts in a prompt, potentially that could be used to train the model and then be available in a response from another user. Just a consideration, maybe unlikely, but it's just something that could happen. In terms of confidential information that's legally required to be kept private, all states have laws about that, and then the federal government has very strict regulations about sharing certain types of information. So if a user did try to incorporate private data into a model, thinking that it was just another tool, there's a lot of statistical software that people can use to analyze data. It might be that because this technology is so nascent, that someone might add confidential information to a model without really thinking about it. So again, some of these are maybe unlikely to have really dramatic impacts, but it's something that could cross actual legal statutes. And so I think one major way to address just that confidentiality issue is to follow the same protocols that you would follow with publishing that data in any other format. So when you publish confidential information in a report that goes on a publicly available website, there are rules about how you can present that data depending on the number of observations. So I think just something that could be incorporated into usage as we move forward. You also mentioned, and we've discussed in this panel, issues around accuracy. And I think that is probably one of the major issues right now. I think anyone who has used ChatGPT to try to find any kind of complex information can tell you that you may request information on 5 states, and maybe one of those states will be accurate, or maybe it'll provide a response with 5 states entities that do exist, and then the actual information for each entity will be inaccurate. So I think the silver lining to that is that as AI models advance and become more sophisticated, they should not be used to replace experts. Experts should be using them in order to conduct their business with their expertise. And so we're going to continue to need humans to ensure that they comply. Any kind of product developed with AI is complying with existing policies and standards. And then lastly, just talking about the idea of AI, if it does get more sophisticated, we are using more tailored models for a legislature so that AI can become more practical for drafting or other purposes. Ensuring that the AI is pulling from the most up-to-date sources in terms of statute is going to be very critical. So when you're drafting a bill or an amendment, if you're using, like, for example, ChatGPT, you're not going to be getting the most recent information. You're going to be getting information from 2020 possibly. And then a lot of legislatures don't make their annotated statutes publicly available for possibly a year after the session has ended. So there's going to need to be some sort of mechanism to incorporate the most up-to-date annotated statutes into any kind of AI model that's used for drafting, and ensuring that all the information that an AI model is pulling from is the most up-to-date, by whatever mechanism that would be.
Thank you so much, William. Just before we proceed, I remember a panel discussion that you participated with the colleagues from iLegis, and I remember quite vividly these inaccuracies on ChatGPT being described as hallucinations. I never forgot that. So I just felt that it was interesting to point that out. Joe, would you like to comment on this issue as well?
Yeah, I think I'll take it just a little bit further in how we can apply this. So we've seen not lots, but one very big example recently of a lawyer getting sanctioned for failure to monitor his ChatGPT generations. So with that, we have to treat these types of tools the same way we treat almost the people involved in the creation of things. And it's currently at or below an apprentice level. So when we have someone of that level creating anything, we want to review it. And so it's a valuable tool to use, but we have to remember, if it's creating content, review it like it's someone just learning to draft. If we're using it to access parts of the workflow, whether it's private information or confidential information or whatnot, we need to have oversight built into the usage of these so that our processes for covering what a new user could do with this information should also apply to the tool itself. And then as we get more comfortable with using it, we can step back a little, but not all the way. And I don't think we'll ever, well, let me say, in my lifetime, I don't think we'll ever reach the state where we can just step back and let it go on its own and feel confident enough that we can just review it at a couple spots during the stage. No, we need to treat it as the valuable tool it is, but it's still just a tool that can and will, just like a person, make mistakes over and over again. And so we just have to build our processes, our safety nets to account for this. And as long as we do that, we shouldn't ever have the part where we come before a judge or we come before the whole body of the legislature and it's just factually wrong. As long as we maintain our processes, follow our processes, don't skip around the same way we do with people, I think we'll be fine. But we have to build those things and make sure they apply to anyone using the technology, because it's easy to do if we build our own AI generative tools that are used only in-house. And then it's easy to maintain these walls, but we have to then make sure that the people who are using these, or potentially outside ones and using these interfaces and giving over information, have to be aware that they might need to vet these things beforehand, just so they're not crossing any of these lines and making any of these problems or headaches for anyone down the line.
Thanks so much, Joe. João, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
Sim. Dos erros mais comuns daquele que iniciam o uso do ChatGPT é pensar que a ferramenta é um banco de dados. Ok. No que se refere à compreensão contextual, mesmo com os avanços em modelo de linguagem, eles ainda não são capazes de entender completamente o contexto da maneira como os humanos fazem. Por isso, o uso de modelos de IA no processo legislativo deve ser combinado com a expertise humana, sempre. É importante treinar o modelo com dados relevantes e contextualizados, o procedimento chamado fine tuning, garantindo assim, até onde for possível, que ele possa fornecer sugestões e respostas coerentes com o contexto jurídico e legislativo. Por fim, o manuseio de informações sensíveis ou classificadas é um ponto que merece muita atenção. A privacidade e a segurança dos dados devem ser priorizados e os modelos de IA não devem ter acesso a informações confidenciais. Essa questão ressalta a importância de implementar políticas de segurança robustas e regulamentações claras sobre o uso de IA no processo legislativo. Era isso.
Thank you so much, João, for your consideration. Allow me to bring for you, Matthew. Would you like to share your thoughts on this question as well?
Yeah, thank you. I certainly would agree with a lot of what's already been said. I think we, as legislative drafters, we as authors, we have the advantage that most of our work gets published and legally has to be published, which is very nice. But that does mean that there is a large amount of text out there which is not a problem. There's no confidentiality problem over it. Where we worry about it is in using AI in actual drafting. I don't know that much about the civil law jurisdictions, but in the common law world, there is this big difference between the presidential systems like the USA and the parliamentary systems like the UK and many of the others in the Commonwealth. So that in the parliamentary systems, the government controls the parliament because the parliament controls the government. And that means that the drafting is generally done by a centralized office on the instructions from the government. That in itself means that the government is going to be a lot more wary about anybody seeing live drafts, including live drafts being fed into any AI system. So I think there will be difficulties to be looked at there. The flip side of that is that we don't have individual members of parliament, individual members of Congress, as they are in the US, drafting things themselves. So we are able to keep some sort of discipline, and I think we would generally see that as meaning that AI would be used to help rather than AI doing the drafting. I still would worry about the bias in AI. I still would worry about people relying too much on what the AI produces, given that it will inevitably lead you down particular avenues that you wouldn't necessarily have been led down otherwise, and you won't necessarily realize why you're being led down those avenues. So we often talk about old-fashioned AI, symbolic, knowledge-based, reasoning, rules-based, and newfangled AI. And the difference is often in explainability. So the new types of AI have a problem as black box, unexplainable. You don't know where this has come from that they're suggesting to you. That really would be our take on it. I think the answer to it from our perspective would be to keep the AI as an assistant, not as the drafter in itself, and not to be using it even to produce a first draft. We would be using it to check a draft or to make suggestions after you've produced a first draft.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your considerations. Before I proceed to our last question, just to inform the audience that if any colleague wishes to pose a question, please raise your hand. The question will be posed either in English or in Portuguese, and it will be done by video and audio in the time no longer than 1 minute. If any colleague wishes to do so at the end of the debate, please, there is an option here in the bottom called raise your hand. So allow me to bring my last question to you, Joe. I was trying to bring a perspective on user experience to this discussion based on a very interesting conversation we had on a recent debate about the digital transformation of legislative drafting. And basically, we all know that UX is a key factor in the acceptance and the effectiveness of AI tools within the legislative process. And a very good example of this is ChatGPT. It's a chat. You can ask your question. You can give a command. Anyone can use it. It's supposed to be simple. And the US House of Representatives is one noteworthy case where a tailored artificial intelligence tool has been implemented to enhance the legislative drafting process, which involved extensive collaboration between the Office of the Legislative Counsel, represented by Wade, that was here earlier today, and by the Office of the Clerk, as well as the private sector, in this case, Xcential legislative technologies. So in your opinion, what have been the most common demands or requests from these offices when it comes to incorporating AI into the workflow of legislative drafting?
Sure. It comes down primarily to three, well, a lot of things, but three I can really talk about. The first is test and verify. And we say this a lot, but it's not just test for accuracy, it's test for understandability, test for acceptance. And so if we're going through, for example, and we're presenting information to the user after it's been processed, we want to make sure that they understand the instructions provided on screen, that they understand the information provided on screen, and that it's presented in a way that is natural to see. And since we deal with text, we want to make sure that it's still legible, that everything's following the same rules, and that it's presented in a visually pleasing manner. And I say that because when there's lots of different ways to present differences in text that are understandable, but it needs to be reliable. And that's where the test and verify mantra comes in. And so we test inside of Xcential to do this. We've tested extensively with the various government entities to make sure that what they're seeing on screen matches and that it makes sense. And it's silly, but it's a bedrock of what we're doing, is that it's all accurate and relatable. The second then becomes that there is an avenue for feedback that can then be incorporated, and they can see that the feedback is incorporated. So we're using the information, they input their bills and they get their outputs. And if something's wrong, we don't want them to feel like it's a failure on their part. It could very well and probably is a failure on the system's part. And so that it needs to be comfortable to let us know that there's a problem, and we need to be very responsive and acceptive of this information, because they're not doing anything wrong. We're not necessarily doing anything wrong. So we have to work together to figure out what's going wrong so it can be resolved. If this sounds like it's pretty boring and normal and not very specialized for AI, it's because it shouldn't be. AI, when it comes down to it, is a system that's being implemented. It needs checks, it needs balances, it needs the capability of feedback. And especially when it's syntactically based AI, it's not learning from its own mistakes. So we have to teach it what's wrong, what it did wrong, and this is a communal effort. The third point, and let's see if I can remember the third point, is yes, we have to bring the technology to the user. It's very easy to and this is true with ChatGPT, make a prompt and a place for a user to have to go to interact with it. But that's not a great way to get users to accept it and want to use the technology. What we need to do is build hooks into existing workflows. And so if they're used to using Word to draft their legislation, we need to come to them and provide an add-in and a way for them to hook into that workflow so that they just want to do it right there. It's not breaking up the flow. It's not changing what they're doing. It's enhancing what they're doing. And if we can get that feeling to come through, that it's enhancing their work, not replacing their work, not correcting their work, but making it better, it's just so much easier to get people to adopt this technology, because then we're not trying to replace them. We're not trying to tell them they're wrong. We're trying to make it easier for them to do their job, to make them better at doing their job, and to give them a more useful tool to do their job. And that's the hardest of all of these things, is to make it not so that they're butting heads with the technology, not that they don't want to do it because they feel they're better than the technology or that they're afraid of the technology, but just that we have to interlace with each other. And I can't say we've done that perfectly. I can't say anyone's done that perfectly, because it is such a hard thing to do. But I think that is the most important element of incorporating AI into any workflow. Will be, and it is the biggest challenge that we have to overcome, more so than making ChatGPT the best legislative generating body ever or the best analytical engine ever. No, those things can be done and those things will be done. But if users aren't going to ever want to use it, what's the point?
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you for your very interesting points. Allow me to bring now for you, Matthew. Would you like to comment on this interface and then this intersection actually between the user interface and AI tools that can help drafters do their job?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I would agree with a lot of what Joe said there, and particularly that point about AI is another form of tech in some ways. So it's the same issue of user acceptance as with any other new tech. In the project that we're working on, we are hoping to use old-fashioned tech and modern tech to be able to enable legislative drafters to mark up the logical structure, to mark up the obligations, and so on. We want to do that in a way that builds on what drafters are already doing, rather than coming in from outside and imposing something. And we are encouraged in that it will mean also you need user acceptance, but you also need some user training. In this, it's not so much user training because of the tech, it's user training to improve, but only improve, the way that drafters see the logical structures that they're creating. So we do feel that what we're doing makes sense and adds up and is logical, and we do check it for logical consistency. But to help drafters see more of how that really works and how that compares to how a computer thinks, if you like. And we're encouraged in that because certainly amongst Commonwealth legislative drafters, things have been developing over the years. The particular case that gives me hope is most Commonwealth drafting offices now don't use shall anymore. We used to scatter shall all over the statute book. We used to use it for definitions. Farmer shall mean a person who works in an agricultural business. When we switched to must instead of shall, we thought we were doing it for plain English purposes, but actually what it's done for us is made us think, oh, hang on a minute, we can't say farmer must mean an agricultural worker. No, we just say farmer means an agricultural worker, and that has brought us to realise, well, not realise, but more appreciate the difference between the provisions that we're making that have effect by operation of law and the provisions that we're making that can be contravened and need some consequence for contravening them. So that in itself has led to more rigour, and we would see this as building on that and using AI to support that, that we would enable legislative drafters to easily pick out for a computer to read, to pick out the logical structure of what they're drafting. So that would be the main area where we would see it. We do very much think that legislative drafting offices do need to be involved, particularly in the rules as code movement, where we do think there is a risk of tech people producing solutions that they think look right to them, if they're not able to talk to the drafters who actually know how it works. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your considerations. William, would you like to share your thoughts on this matter as well?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so as I mentioned, in the introduction, our organization serves all legislatures, and as part of our work, we receive requests for information from many staff and legislators themselves about a wide range of topics. And so, with the the new prominence of ChatGPT in the public eye, we have been getting more requests about artificial intelligence recently. However, almost all these requests have to do with regulating the use of AI by state agencies or by private businesses or by individuals. I think the one conversation that I'm aware of from staff that are curious about AI is the use of it in bill grouping. So I have heard questions about that, but it's still so nascent that I think that's something that we're going to be hearing more about, especially in this upcoming session. As I talked about a little bit before, legislators are using the technology for drafting bills here in the U.S. We don't know how many staff or legislators are using it to, in any component of, drafting an idea, but there are three prominent examples in the U.S. media. There was a representative who drafted a bill in Massachusetts to regulate AI. They used ChatGPT. There was a member in Alaska who was playing around with Bing to draft an amendment potentially And then they were impressed enough with the results that they drafted a bill about gambling on ferries. And then a US representative in California likewise used ChatGPT to draft a bill about regulating AI. So these are all very preliminary results, but that's some of the usage that I think we've seen so far. But I foresee in this upcoming session that there is likely to be the start of conversations about regulating AI, to what extent it can be helpful for drafters, and potentially internal policies by legislatures about who can use AI for work products in the legislature, possibly restrictions, possibly outright bans on certain products. But that's something that time will tell, but I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future and not less.
Thank you so much, William, for your considerations. Now we're going to yield the floor to João to share his thoughts as well. João, would you like to share your comments around this topic?
Sim. A questão da experiência do usuário é uma questão muito importante. No Senado, estamos no estágio inicial do uso da inteligência artificial para a elaboração dos projetos de lei, testando protótipos e explorando possibilidades, usando para isso a própria interface do ChatGPT. Contudo, o usuário não vai usar essa interface. O nosso objetivo é integrar a API do GPT ao nosso editor de documentos legislativo, o LexEdit. Estamos planejando criar botões que forneçam assistência para tarefas específicas, mantendo também a possibilidade de diálogo e permitindo que o usuário decida quando e como utilizar cada recurso. Adicionalmente, planejamos usar a API para implementar funções de sumarização e classificação em nossos sistemas que gerenciam o processo legislativo e a base estruturada de normas jurídicas. Estamos em fase de teste com uma aplicação que utiliza o modelo Whisper, também da OpenAI, para a transcrição das falas dos senadores. Essa funcionalidade está sendo avaliada pela nossa equipe da taquigrafia e os resultados preliminares são animadores. A intenção é integrá-la à ferramenta Escriba usada na elaboração das notas taquigráficas. E, quem sabe, também possibilitar o uso do LexEdit com a interface de voz. É uma possibilidade. Enfim, temos diversas oportunidades e pretendemos implementar a inteligência artificial em várias etapas da elaboração legislativa, sempre buscando aprimorar a experiência do usuário. Obrigado.
Thank you so much, João, for your considerations on this final question. I see that there are no questions here from the colleagues. So what I will do, I will yield the floor back to each one of you for your closing remarks about today's panel. João, would you like to start with your closing remarks?
Sim. Agradeço ao Luís, à Bússola Tech, a chance de compartilhar nossas experiências e aprender com as experiências de outros parlamentos. Acredito que a inteligência artificial trará benefícios para os parlamentos que ultrapassam os benefícios da adoção de microcomputadores na década de 90. Será possível fazer mais, melhor e de forma mais eficiente, economizando tempo e recursos. Contudo, devemos permanecer atentos em relação aos possíveis usos prejudiciais dessa tecnologia para os parlamentos e para a democracia. Desse painel, achei bem importante essa ideia, que eu acho que ficou consensual, que o ChatGPT não é uma ferramenta para criar uma versão inicial de um projeto de lei. É uma ferramenta que vai permitir aprimorá-lo, vai permitir polir o texto, vai permitir tornar mais claro e fazer análises prospectivas. Eu acho que temos uma ótima ferramenta para os próximos anos. Muito obrigado pelo convite, Luís.
Thank you so much, João, for your considerations and your final thoughts. It was a pleasure to welcome you here today. Following the alphabetic order, Joe, would you like to share any closing remarks?
First, thank you for letting me be here today. It's been enjoyable. It's nice to both hear of different legislative bodies incorporating tools and not being afraid, because there's a lot of fear of generative AI and other AIs in general out there, but it is just a tool that we can all use to make things better. And it's just wonderful to be around a group of people that are thinking about it that way and how can we use it as a tool to make things better. And that's really all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe, for your final thoughts. Matthew, would you like to share your closing remarks?
Yes, thank you. I would join in thanking you for organising this and inviting me. I found it very useful particularly to be able to hear the civil law country and the American perspective and compare it with ours. And I do think that we are going to find the public and members of parliaments are expecting something to happen with generative AI because they've been able to use it themselves. It's slightly different from any previous technology. They're using it, they're going to expect us to be using it, and we need to be thinking about what it's safe to use for and why we're going to say, oh, we're not going to use it for this particular aspect because that is too risky, but we are going to use it for this other aspect. So I think hearing a variety of different types of parliament and their approaches is very useful for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your closing remarks. William, would you like to share your final thoughts as well?
Yes, thank you, Luís, and thank you for having me here today. It's been an honor to be speaking here with our other panelists and with you. I think just my closing thought is that this is still a very nascent technology in terms of drafting. This is the very early stages of something that is likely to evolve into something much more prolific and much more common across legislatures. There's a lot of promise to the technology. I think one of the greatest opportunities is going to be with tailored applications that uses machine learning that incorporates specific statutes and drafting practices of individual legislatures. So it's something that I think is going to be more and more focused on. Our organization is looking at this, and future events will be holding sessions about AI specifically and the use of AI. So this is definitely something that is not going away. It's going to become more common. But with that, again, I thank you again for having me here, and it's been a pleasure.